My name is Russell White. I am a junior double majoring in politics and international relations with a minor in philosophy. So my inspiration for this paper, Helping the Damned, Displaced, and Forgotten, was sort of a response to a prompt in paper within Deborah Dale's class, Human Rights and World Politics, that trying to find what is the biggest human rights priority that we face today. So I decided to choose refugee rights, considering the most recent Syrian refugee crisis we are seeing in the Middle East. At the same time, though, I was heavily inspired by Erica Feller, who has served as an assistant high commissioner of protection for the UNHCR, because she's given several works and papers on the overall historical perspective on the evolution development on refugee rights ever since the founding of the UNHCR in 1951. So going off of her work, I sort of built off further and started to add in some more themes like, the critical importance of now climate change and how that affects how we treat refugees and how we view refugees. So with that further, I will go into my introduction. So going through from 1950 until now, about roughly 70 years, there were certain three things I found at the very end, concluding that was one, that the overall analysis of refugee rights, like other human rights, has a very mixed record. There's a lot of positive progression from then until now. But there's been a lot of major setbacks and challenges that we're starting to experience more today. And Erica Feller even referred to our period as sort of like a limbo or crossroads as to where the modern day refugee protection regime may end up going. So it's really critical for us during this time because it's up to us to determine in what direction we, as an international community, are going to go. The second thing was that the idea of refugee rights is a constantly evolving concept. My paper goes as far back as 1685 in reference to the French Protestants, the Huguenots, as the first real case that we see as refugees, following about 40 years after the Treaty of Westphalia. But for the sake of today, I won't go that much far into the past. The other thing was that there are several options we have, referring back to that crossroads we have in moving forward. And the one thing I argue heavily at near the end of my paper is that if we really want to see a strength not only just in international security, but in protection of human rights, we have to seriously come together as member states and revisit and reaffirm our commitment to the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. Going forward, you'll see that I lay out each slide in terms of eras, the same way that Erica Feller does in her work. So the 1950s are characterized as the founding and the developing and the foundation of human rights. The 1960s and 70s were viewed as the era of growth and expansion. The 1980s and 90s were seen as the era of restraint and challenge. And then we see today, the 2000s and moving forward, as the crossroads period. So in the 1950s, we kind of start our journey with the establishment of the UNHCR on January 1st, 1951. It was formed on December 14th, 1950, but wasn't actually put into practice until 1951. And so the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which I've been referring to as the UNHCR, its original mandate was actually very limited in scope. In its very first sentence, it talks about, as a result of events before January 1st, 1951. The scope of the UNHCR was in direct reference to the refugees and those displaced in the face of the war in World War II, Nazism, and persecution. So at this time, it only actually applied to the European continent and those who were involved in that war. However, it's not necessarily that bad of a thing because some really important things that the 1951 Convention did was lay down some very important foundational and basic principles in which we still operate under today. One of them being the principle of non-refoulement, that being that no person will be forced to go back to a country where they face the threat of persecution or real persecution. And the other importance of how there will be no discrimination on how refugee rights is applied to all refugees. Just to name a few examples of those foundational basic principles in which we operate today. However, I realized there's a little cut off there. There were this wasn't just a period of just initial founding. There was also some really important accomplishments made by the UNHCR, such as one, in 1954, they won the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in Europe. And then secondly, in 1956, they helped lead efforts to resettle 200,000 people during the Hungarian Revolution. Now, kind of fast forwarding to the 1960s and 70s, the era of growth and expansion. In response to the decolonization efforts happening in Africa, it was realized that the mandate of the UNHCR was not really helpful in this case, since it was just limited to Europe and also time sensitive. And so what was done is that they drafted and adopted the 1967 protocol. And it did two important things. One, it omitted that time frame sensitivity, and in all cases where it said before events of January 1st, 1951 was completely omitted. And then secondly, it then extended its mandate to all those who are member states of the UN, so that way it could be applied to parts of Africa and the rest of the world. Also, what really helped in kind of growing and expanding the idea of what we define as a refugee, there were really important regional instruments like the Convention of the OAU, also known as the Convention on specific aspects of refugee rights in Africa. This did several things. One, it kind of expanded what would be considered refugee. So they included instances of where there would be a high disturbance of peace within a state, and as well as foreign domination and also occupation. So this also led to the expansion to include at sometimes those displaced by natural disasters. And then later it also introduced the idea of voluntary repatriation, which was then made official within Article 5 of the UNHCR. There's been several regional instruments, but for sake of time, I won't refer to them. But if you want to see more on those applications, I encourage you to read the paper. Going next to the 1980s and 90s, this is where we begin to see a lot of sort of like retrenchment and restraints on this modern day refugee protection regime, mostly due to like a lot of political and economic turbulence during and after the Cold War. During the 1970s, leading into the 1980s, there was a lot of economic crises happening, and it really showed how the idea of refugee rights is really sensitive to economics, which is really unfortunate, but it's true. At the same time, we also saw an increase in inter-ethnic conflicts in newly independent states, which were just only further aggravated by the superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so we started to see large-scale flows of refugees coming forward as a result of even like low-level conflicts, because human rights abuses were now being used as military strategy and not just as a byproduct of war. An example, the former Yugoslavia, where there was the destruction of homes, churches and mosques, and also the execution of genocide, which ended up leading up to about 4 million Yugoslavians being displaced. And lastly, states then began to resort to a restrictive application of both the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. While simultaneously this is happening, the UNHCR is trying to grow in its scope, while member states are starting to kind of be a little more restrictive on how they actually accept and flows of refugees, since they're starting to view some of those migrants as actually being people who want more economic opportunities, but under the guise of being a refugee. So he started labeling refugees as more of a threat to political and economic stability. And then we kind of fast forward to sort of today. We kind of see what's happening with the Syrian crisis. It's placed a lot of considerable challenges within Europe and its surrounding neighbors. Right now, the Pew Research Center actually did a survey of the 10 European countries in 2016, and the 3 of the largest countries showed a lot of disapproval on how the EU is actually handling the migration crisis. Greece showed a 94% disapproval, Sweden showing an 88% disapproval, and Italy with a 77% disapproval. The country with the most support was the Netherlands, but they only gave 31% support on how the EU is actually managing the crisis. And Turkey right now is actually having a hard time managing this inflow of refugees, because they're now starting to realize these aren't going to be temporary guests. And so now they're starting to face the issue of how do we integrate them in our society. And now they're starting to face issues of rising rent costs, competition for wages, all on top of where there are in certain host communities where there's ethnic strife and conflicts between Turks and now new Syrian refugees. And now we're starting to see an increase in numbers of IDPs and refugees displaced by natural disasters. The International Displacement Monitoring Center released certain concerning statistics, how in 2010 there was a lone 42 million people displaced by sudden onset disasters, and in 2011 there was 15 million people displaced. And on average since 2008 we've been seeing an average of 26.4 million people displaced per year. As you can see, that caused a lot of issues for how we can handle that capacity of influx of people. Let's just skip forward to the end here. So going back to the point here, the overall analysis of this paper, looking at the historical perspective, is seeing how there is a mixed sort of response. We do see a positive progression for the most part, but now we're in a period where we're starting to have a lot of serious questionings on our commitment to human rights and also our commitment to state sovereignty, because those things often conflict. And then also, like I said, this has a very dynamic and evolving nature. And so it's really hard to tell where it's going to go 20, 30, 40 years in the future, considering how much has changed in the last 67 years alone. And then lastly, these were the three options that my paper ended up giving. The first option is obviously regrettable. The second option is kind of highly unlikely, knowing how states really do favor their sovereignty. So the most likely option we have as an international community is to favor the third option. We revisit and reaffirm our commitments and try to balance our own domestic capacity with that of our responsibility internationally. Thank you. Do you guys have any questions for me?
Is there an impact on where the refugees are from vis-a-vis your xenophobic assertion?
Well, right now, the most I've seen is since we're right now having a lot of influx from refugees from the Middle East, both as a result from Syria and also the recent acts from ISIS or ISIL, however you want to call them. So you're starting to see a lot of reactions from both Western countries. You know, you have Angela Merkel's own party, the CDU, or as I know it as the CDU, a little German there. They're starting to really criticize her laissez-faire approach to migration. Then also you have the recent UKIP party, which came to power within England, who tend to have very anti-migrant views. And also here in the US with the newly elected Donald Trump, who ran on a campaign of barring migrants coming in from the Middle East, and did so arguably successfully with one of his executive acts. So right now, the most I had in at least terms of our most recent times has been mostly placed on Arabs and Muslims. So there is a bit of a xenophobic and also a religious discrimination upon those from the Middle East. We've also seen other signs of xenophobia within the past, such as from those from the Balkans, back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and so on and so forth. So like there's this growing like cultural tension and also ethnic tension within the traditional host communities who accept refugees.
What is the, did you look at all the openness of the Persian Gulf states to refugees from Syria or other parts of the region that are generating floods?
Yeah, Eric Feller and even other scholars do mention how there are still states that are open to accepting refugees. Like there are a lot of states, even like you could say Uruguay, who really do believe in like the mission of the UN. So they often are friendly to these ideas. And also going back to your point of the Persian Gulf states, but I didn't really focus on it too much because I was looking at the overall trend of where the modern day refugee protection regime is going and seeing how the biggest supporters for this in the past, even the creators of what we know as the UN in this modern day protection regime, is that of those found in the West. We're starting to see how there's a lot of pullback because people, a country like the US, are not really putting much funding or commitments towards the UN and other following divisions. And so even if we do have the Persian Gulf states who are accepting, we still have this overall trend of those who are kind of falling back and retrenching. And even then, there's other states in Southeast Asia which are starting to question how much they're willing to commit as well. And so in response to that, we're starting to see more regional protection regimes developing and kind of contrary to the overall international one. And so it kind of provides an issue whenever you have certain regions dictating what they think should be the rights and protections of refugees versus the overall United Nations. And so the Persian Gulf states are a good example of that because they're starting to like redefine what they think is the proper rights and protection of refugees. In a way, it's kind of good though because you need it at times, but in other instances, it's kind of concerning.
Thanks so much, Russell.
Thank you.